And now for an amazing true story from the book of Mark, chapters 14 and 15.
Peter and John huddled together with the other disciples in a darkened room after the worst day in their lives.
Surely this can't be the end of it all. It doesn't make sense. A few days ago, they wanted to make Jesus a king. How did it come to this?
Peter's thoughts tumbled back to the previous week when Jesus, along with Peter and the other disciples, had been the center of lavish attention as they entered Jerusalem. Peter could almost still hear the crowds as Jesus entered the town riding on a donkey.
There he is! It's Jesus!
Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord!
Hosanna! Hosanna! Hosanna!
Peter, walking behind Jesus, had shouted so John could hear him over the crowd.
This is it, John. After all this time, Jesus is finally claiming his rightful place.
But despite the festive welcome, things had quickly gotten tense. The religious leaders had been looking for a way to ensnare Jesus, and when he chased the money changers and merchants out of the temple, they were incensed.
You have made my Father's house a den for robbers. We've got to stop him right now.
Patience. All we need is an opening.
The religious leaders soon found the perfect way to get to Jesus. One of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, offered to hand Jesus over to them for 30 pieces of silver. As Jesus and the disciples had finished praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas had arrived leading a crowd of guards and angry men with clubs and swords. Peter had grabbed John by the arm.
There's Judas. He just walked out on us at dinner.
Sure looks like he's got a plan.
I don't like it.
Before Peter could move, Judas hurried right up to Jesus and kissed him.
What's he doing?
It's a signal.
Sure enough, as soon as Judas had shown the mob which man was Jesus, they had descended on Jesus and arrested him.
No! How can he be a king if they arrest him?
Peter had thrown himself right in the midst of the crowd, trying to defend Jesus with his sword. But Jesus quickly put a stop to it. The rough crowd had fallen to silence as Jesus spoke.
Do you have to come out with swords and clubs to capture me? I taught in the temple courtyard, and you didn't arrest me. But the scriptures must come true.
Peter had watched horrified as Jesus had allowed himself to be taken away. Many of the disciples fled, but Peter trailed behind, trying not to be seen.
How can this be God's plan?
Later, Peter had found himself huddling in the courtyard of the high priest, trying to find out what was happening inside. As a lanky red-headed servant burst out the door, a dark-haired servant girl had taken him by the arm.
What's happening?
You won't believe it. The high priest, he asks if this Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God.
And what does Jesus say to that?
He says, I am, and some other stuff. And they all say he's guilty, and that he's got to die. No.
The servants had looked at him sharply.
You were with Jesus, weren't you?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Now, several hours later, Peter was hiding out with the others. He felt his stomach knot in shame.
I was so afraid of being arrested that I denied I knew him again. 2 more times.
Peter, who had said with certainty that Jesus was God's son, had forgotten that God had a bigger plan. John shifted uncomfortably on the hard floor.
You're not the only one who ran. I just wish we knew what was happening out there.
Yes, but you saw him. Today.
Look, it's really hard to talk about it.
John took a deep breath and tried once more to share the terrible things he had seen. They had all heard the terrible news in the morning, that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to the Roman governor Pilate, who questioned him.
Are you the king of the Jews?
Yes, it is just as you say.
You've heard all the things they say you're guilty of. Aren't you going to say something?
But Jesus hadn't defended himself. Finally, Pilate turned to the crowd.
What should I do with the one you call king of the Jews? Crucify him! Crucify him! Why? What has he done? Crucify him!
Pilate had wished to keep the crowd happy, so he went along with their demands. He ordered that Jesus be whipped and handed him over to be killed. John hadn't wanted to see what happened next, but he found himself climbing the hill of Golgotha anyway. Finally, he raised his head.
This can't be happening.
There above him, 3 wooden crosses towered against the dark sky. Jesus hung on the center cross, nailed to the wood by his hands and feet. Onlookers shouted and mocked.
Come down from the cross! Save yourself! He saved others, but he can't save himself.
Why doesn't he show them? Why doesn't he do something?
At long last, Jesus had called out,
My God, why have you deserted me?
and with a long, loud cry, Jesus took his last breath and died. Now, as the night closed in, John and Peter and the other disciples could do nothing but hide out. They all jumped as the door flung open and Mary Magdalene burst in.
We saw where they took him.
What? Where?
Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for Jesus' body. We followed. Joseph laid the body in a tomb.
So, he's really dead. Gone. This is... It's all wrong.
I don't know. I think, what if we're missing something?
God did have a plan, a much bigger plan, and it was still playing out. But the disciples had to wait 2 more days before they would discover the rest of the story.